Greetings, friends, and welcome to Chapter 13 of the Grand Design Exposed, entitled England's Religious War Expanded to New World. And I, for one, am quite thankful that I got done with the reading of Chapter 12, especially with all the Frenchy names added to it. Chapter 12 was basically a rehash of the French Revolution that happened after the American Revolution, and how the French Revolution was essentially a prototype as to what we see going on in the world today, and how the French Revolution had a lot of Masonic and Illuminati ties to it, which also ties back to the head of the octopus, which is the Jesuit order and the Vatican, or the Roman Catholic Church. And so, in Chapter 13, we are going to start to endeavor on some, well, let's just say we're going to probably begin to step on people's toes that have a grounded root in American patriotism. This is going to be basically the starting point of that. And so, and Chapter 13 is going to lead us into that direction. So, the first section is called The European Bully. To bring the issues we have been discussing into better perspective and to give a clearer picture, let's take a brief walk down history lane. For example, there was not so very long ago a bully who stalked the fair land, whose ferociousness and appetite to mutilate tender human bodies never seemed to be satisfied. But wait, don't be alarmed. The shrieks of the dying was sanctioned on good authority, the name of God and the holy Roman Catholic religion. However, there seems to be a unique feature built into every bully, and in this particular bully, it was working quite well. When getting a slight taste of its own medicine, to be able to yell the very loudest. Rome screams and cries from England's horrible persecution against her saintly Jesuits defending their faith is enough to win over the most sensitive of all sympathetic ears. Ain't that the truth? Because you'll hear emphatically the persecutions of the Jesuits and these types of things under, England, and it'll create a sense of sympathy. And just like a bully, just like as the illustration of the bully, the bully will access superiority and persecutions against, the lesser people. But when that bully is attacked, then it's usually the cries of the bully that garners the sympathy. Okay, it's the same situation here. But in doing so, one must disregard completely England's Queen Elizabeth excommunicated by the Pope, her subjects urged to rise up against her, the Spanish Armada, the Gunpowder Plot, the Inquisition, St. Bartholomew's Massacre, the 30 Years' War, the Irish Massacre, and the Bible, and come back into the fold, the only and true fold. That guarantees mankind his eternal salvation. How nostalgic. With this kind of thinking, it becomes understandable and generally accepted the belief in the saying that the whole world loves a lie. Certainly the whole world is living a lie, and giving it just a little more time will surely die in its lie. The Bible is a most hated and detested book. Why? because it contradicts everything that intellectual man teaches and believes. Like the Bible teaches truth, such as man, his earth, and all things upon it were created in a literal 7-day week, just under 6,000 years ago, by a personal and loving Creator God. That there was sin, a universal flood because of sin, the promise of a Savior to bring man back in right standing with God, who actually came, died in our stead, was resurrected, received into heaven, and upon departing, gave the promise that he would return at an appointed time to gather all those who believe these truths to be sacred. But man loves and prefers his lies. Like the evolution of this planet taking billions of years to form the Big Bang Theory, or man evolving from a monkey, intellectuals dismiss any such thing as sin. A world flood is considered preposterous. Homosexuality is A-OK. And Jesus Christ is just one of many cosmic Christs. Above all, there certainly is not a God who judges man or will ever intervene in his affairs. Therefore, the Bible is ridiculed, mocked, and scoffed at, and held in such contempt and derision by the educated class that it discourages all, except the most weak-minded, according to them, to even approach the book. So by undermining the Bible, a more effective means to prevent it from being read is accomplished than ever by placing it on the index of forbidden books. Thus, in one master stroke, the only true source of truth is destroyed. However, Jesus Christ declared, "Search the Scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, and they are that which testify of me." John 5:39. One thing the Bible consistently emphasizes throughout its pages is the overwhelming ratio of those who reject Bible truth, as compared with the almost insignificant few who embrace it. And as the whole world marches along in perfect step and harmony in its absurd and superstitious beliefs, Scripture also teaches quite plainly something else. Break ranks or bob out of step with the hallowed opinions and sacred oracles of the world, and you have the most excellent opportunity to become a member of their casualty list. The entire history and teaching of the Bible is a record of those two simple facts. The whole world contentedly believe in a lie, and anyone challenging or supporting contrariwise will end up stigmatized or suffer a martyr's death. The 11th chapter of Hebrews has been called the faith chapter. However, its last portion reads more like an obituary notice for believers. The life and death of Christ graphically bears witness to this, as well as what he taught his disciples, that ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake, but he that endureth to the end shall be saved. He that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loses his life for my sake shall find it. Matthew 10:22 and 39. So the people of God recognize full well that they can never win the war with the world's most beloved Roman Catholic religion and its Pope. For Scripture itself declares in Revelation 13:7 that it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. The theme of denouncing the existing system is traditional, old, and no longer workable, and then urging for a change in the order of things. Began with the so-called Enlightenment movement and its Illuminati, which produced the American and French Revolution, abolished the monarchy system of government and replaced it with democracy. It now extends itself full circle with this propaganda campaign that is prodding us for a change today. But the concept to bring about a change, as we are referring to here, had its inspiration and roots in only one place: England's intense historical struggle with the Roman Catholic quote-unquote bully to brutally force her to change her religion to that of Rome's. When force didn't work, then more and more subtlety was resorted to, and the greatest of these, the master plan, or the great work, or grand design, was to deceptively and covertly set up a Roman Catholic colony among the Protestant North American English colonies. Then, cautiously and meticulously pose it as a haven of civil and religious freedom for all worshippers so as to be accepted by Protestantism, and in enough time bring the great work to a glorious fulfillment. That is, to bring not just the English but the whole world to the realization that it needs to change and worship according to Rome. Hope you're understanding the significance of what I just read. Moving on. England standing alone. The little island of Protestant England had not a friend or ally in all of Europe, only a ring of watchful enemies waiting to pounce on her at the first sign of weakness, restrained only by their distrust of one another. The clamor for the blood of English heretics and their Jezebel queen, Elizabeth, was for over 30 years a rallying cry that swept the people of Europe back and forth in blind storms of emotion, spurring them on to hasten their plans for an English invasion. Vigorously involved were Spain's Governor-General, Alexander Furness, Duke of Parma, who was ruthlessly suppressing the Protestant rebels in the Netherlands to bow to Rome. Enrique de Guzman, Count of Olivares, the Spanish ambassador at Rome, Don Bernardino de Mendoza, the Spanish resident ambassador in Paris, and King Philip II himself of Spain, the most powerful sovereign in Europe and champion of Catholic orthodoxy, who in his youthful years had been King of England through his marriage to Bloody Mary Tudor. Mendoza, known for having sent a message to Queen Elizabeth, quote, that Bernardino de Mendoza was born not to disturb kingdoms but to conquer them, unquote, acted also for his king as paymaster of the ultra-Catholic conspiracy known as the Holy League. The League whose powerful chieftains, Henry, Duke of Guise, and his brothers, served the religious interests of the papacy and France and was closely allied with the ultramontane wing of the clergy, the Jesuits, also for the preservation of the Orthodox Roman Catholic faith. It was a fearful and menacing array of forces that was foaming and frothing across the Channel, that was preparing an invasion fleet, marshaling soldiers and war supplies, and labeling their intentions to bring England back to Rome as the Enterprise. But add to this the active underground Jesuit mission that conveyed priests, students, couriers, and refugees in and out of England, who distributed clandestinely their printed books and pamphlets by the thousands, that incited and agitated and kept the minds and hearts of the Catholic faithful panting for the day of liberation. Is it any wonder that from the intense stress and apprehensions inflicted on the English that it would not cause them to react severely in the defense and security of their nation? Certainly, any rational government would have. Amazingly, though, with all the acts of treason that outsiders hyped up and encouraged against the government of England, when the invasion actually came, not one Englishman sided with the enemy or forsook their beloved queen. And now we come to Rome's offensive. The English government decreed that since the Catholic priesthood and their schools instructed its students in the skills of conspiracy to rebel and overthrow their Protestant government, then the priests would be banned from England and the Catholic schools closed. It was during these times that an aristocratic English Catholic by the name of Dr. William Allen left his country in 1565 for the last time, with a dream vaguely hatching in his brain. He pondered that if the faith was to be preserved and restored in his lost fatherland, then a freshly trained priesthood had to be organized, explicitly for the purpose of being secretly sent back into England to exhort, encourage, and rouse the persecuted flock to action, in defiance of the law. It was this dream, this vision, to bring about a religious change that formed in the head of William Allen. Unwittingly to him, that became the birthplace and seed that was destined to grow, expand, and be molded to fit each situation that later emerged as the grand design. William Allen was ordained a priest shortly after his departure from England at Mechlin, Belgium. Then, after a visit to Rome, his dream began to take shape as a reality when, 3 years later, in 1568, he founded his first English college in Douai, France. This was 10 years after Queen Elizabeth had come to the English throne, and 20 years before the attempted Spanish invasion. In 1575, Allen made a second visit to Rome, this time to help Pope Gregory XIII found another English college that would be in Rome, and also to train missionaries for England. Being greatly attached to the Jesuits, it was only natural that they joined him in the work of the English mission. The first two English Jesuits to re-enter England was Robert Parsons and Edmund Campion. Campion was executed for his troubles, but Parsons escaped, and returning to Allen, they collaborated together and became joint leaders of the Spanish party among English Catholics. The career of William Allen and his obsession to restore Catholicism in England won for him universal admiration and gratitude in the Catholic realm. At the request of King Philip II, Allen was created cardinal in 1587 and held himself in readiness to go to England immediately, should the Armada invasion the following year prove successful. He was sorely disappointed. One of his chief literary works was the preparation of the well-known Douay Bible that appeared complete in 1609, 2 years before the English King James Version. In 1589, he cooperated with Jesuit Parsons in establishing a third English college at Valladolid in Spain. His fourth and last visit to Rome, he resided at the English college there until his death in October 16th of 1594. So without question, Rome's most preferred method in dealing with challenges to her cooked up divine authority is to ruthlessly crush and eliminate them. However, clandestine tactics also became quite beneficial, especially when brutality seems to fail. It just requires a little more time and patience. Thus, by the concerted efforts and legacy left by William Allen, his English colleges and seminarians that collaborated with the Jesuits and their infernal intrigues, instigations, and deep-laid conspiracies gave the Catholic hierarchy assurance, if necessary, to wage a proficient and prolonged warfare. And Rome fully knows, as long as it takes, when she has conquered English Protestantism, then her victory over all Protestantism will be complete as well. Protestants sleeping today are oblivious to what Rome does to her prisoners of war. To the informed and unbiased observer, the fury and rage expressed by the Roman Catholic hierarchy at the conduct of King Henry VIII of England for usurping the position claimed by the Pope of Rome as the supreme head of Christendom, then investing that same title in himself over English Christians, must seem a little absurd and almost laughable. pretty much like a petty thief heisting from a professional thief something he had previously stolen. Certainly enough to set any thief into a frenzy. For the Pope of Rome has no more right to that title according to Scripture than did King Henry VIII. The only difference is the usurpation of the Pope of Rome took centuries to accomplish, while it took Henry VIII only a few years. But the fury and rage of Rome's propaganda nonsense rants on as it spews out its venom and misinformation upon unsuspecting and naive minds. And so picture to the world is the tyranny and horror of English Protestantism enforced by excommunicated, illegitimate, bastard child of Anne Boleyn, Queen Elizabeth, and those who succeeded her at a time of uncomparably vicious and unbearable persecution. Quite naturally, gone is the memory of that reign of 5 short years before Elizabeth took the throne by her half-sister, Bloody Mary, who ordered the gruesome Smithfield fires and others throughout England that consumed alive over 300 victims who refused to worship according to Rome. And just like as a previous paragraph, but when it comes to, the persecution of Catholics, that's when you hear the voice of the bully cry out. But persecution against Protestants from the previous reign of Bloody Mary, well, that just gets kind of shrugged under the rug. And, voices don't cry out anymore. But, when the bully gets pushed, you'll hear that voice cry out. Perhaps by now, the reader may think this book's main purpose is to bash Catholics and the Jesuits. Many will even cry out denouncing it as hate literature. In all sincerity, this is just not the case. Let's be reasonable. Is it called hate when one is arrested for a crime and the court demands a pre-trial investigation into the suspect's past criminal record? Certainly not. It's more likely to be called practical and plain good common sense. In effect, doesn't our past record actually become substantial proof of what our character is at present? Most of us are creatures of habit. What we did yesterday, we will surely do today. So for a judge to review a suspect's past history is paramount for him to understand the truth, enabling him to make a just and wise decision. It has been said that the word philosophy actually means one who loves wisdom. Anyone who is curious enough to learn knowledge and is never satisfied may be called a philosopher. The desire of this book is not to convey hate, but hopefully to share knowledge, truth, and wisdom. For the evidence produced herein are not fabrications, but facts taken from record books of history. So now if the criminal just happens to be well loved, extremely rich, affluent, and powerful, with the public clamoring against even a trial, how does a just court rule? At the very least, to reveal past atrocious crimes. Or in the name of religion, grant full amnesty. Suppose it was your loved one that was butchered. You be the judge. I mean, clearly, wouldn't you want that same investigation to continue on until finally there is a verdict? Regardless of how loving and charismatic and friendly that this institution might be, especially in this day and age, because clearly what do we get from Rome? We get a peaceful, loving, caring pope who goes to the poor and washes their feet. And how dare we criticize what seems to be an act of charity and love for the common man. But behind the scenes of history proves it's nothing but a bloodlust ploy. Again, you be the judge if your child was a victim of this same institution. Wouldn't you want further investigation? Wouldn't you want further questioning? You be the judge. England's line of defense. The punishment for treason in England under Protestant rulership was real enough, but only in proportion to the aggressiveness of the priests of Rome. And so the tide of persecution ebbed and flowed, sometimes abating, at other times with increased severity, but always Rome's hostile and criminal acts set the pace. And even though the penal laws were always on the statute books as ready weapons, they were never enforced with uniform rigidity. In Queen Elizabeth's 45-year reign, there were 128 priests, 58 laymen, and 3 women executed for treason. During the reign of James I, 20 priests and 8 laymen were executed, and in the reign of Charles I, there were only 2. In most cases, they did not suffer death by burning. That vile method was consecrated for Roman Church use only. The fountainhead and chief perpetrator of torture in the West. The penal laws of England that compelled all and that affected the Puritans, Reformed churches, as well as Catholics, to take the oath of supremacy and conform to the Church of England continued in effect from the time Henry VIII enacted his statute called the Act of Supremacy in 1535 for 256 years after till 1791. For those who choose to refuse, and you could, in lieu of conforming, a fine had to be paid or have your property confiscated. Only treason brought the death penalty, and even that dwindled to where 1681 became the last year for a Catholic to be executed for his faith. The evidence of leniency that the English government always seemed to nurture is recognized discreetly even in the 1909 Catholic Encyclopedia, Volume 5, Subject England, page 449, where it states, quote, "Notwithstanding the severities of Elizabeth, the number of Catholic clergy on the English missions in her time was considerable. It has been estimated that at the end of the 16th century, they amounted to 365, 50 being survivors of the old Marian priests, 300 priests from Douai and the other foreign seminaries, and 16 priests of the Society of Jesus," unquote. And page 450, it states, quote, "With the accession of Charles I, 1625, a somewhat brighter time began for English Catholics. He was unwilling to shed their innocent blood. Indeed, only 2 underwent capital punishment while he bore rule, and this reluctance was one of the causes of rupture between him and the Parliament. His policy," Hallam writes, quote, "with some fluctuations, was to wink at the domestic exercise of the Catholic religion and to admit its professors to pay compensations for clemency, which were not regularly enforced," unquote. The number of Catholic clergy in England received a considerable augmentation in his reign. Panzani reported to the Holy See that in 1634 there were on the English mission 500 secular priests, some 160 Jesuits, 100 Benedictines, 20 Franciscans, 7 Dominicans, 2 Minims, 5 Carmelites, and 1 Carthusian lay brother, besides the clergy, 9 in number, who served the Queen's chapel. You know, and again, it's very funny because here you hear about the persecution of Catholics, And you see how few in number it is. But they're the ones that are crying the loudest. Whereas anywhere up to 50 to, I've heard of numbers up to 100 million of innocent Protestant souls were butchered, flayed, beheaded, hung on spears, their babies' heads bashed against tree trunks, you know, but it's the bully that usually cries the loudest when it's in trouble. The influx of priests had become so great that by 1598 Pope Gregory XIII appointed an archpriest, and by 1623 the mission was enlarged into a province. Wonder of wonders, during the alleged most horrible time of Catholic persecution, Roman priests were literally flocking to England by the hundreds. Really now, can there be any doubt as to what all these priests were actually doing, other than reviving the drooping spirits and rekindling a burning flame in the dying hearts of the Catholic faithful, which is innocently and noble enough? But to Rome that can mean only one thing: complete submission by all to the authority of Rome. And to accomplish just this, a quote-unquote plan was in the making, not only to cleverly circumvent English Protestantism, but all others as well. There were two monumental factors about English Protestantism that not only concerned and haunted Rome and her priesthood, but seemed to taunt them as well. First, Rome was not just dealing with the Church of England, which was bad enough, and that its arrogant heresy was made the law of the land, but there was a massive segment of Protestants rising up in strength, who believed, according to Scripture, that the Church of England, even though it had separated itself from Rome, was shamefully clinging on to most of Rome's tenets that were blatantly false doctrines. These Puritans wanted these corrupt practices abandoned immediately and the Church of England purified. But worse than that, because Rome had become such a virtual moral cesspool, the more one studied the Scriptures, the more it became obvious just how much her doctrines were in rottenness of error. So many ardent reformers, in turn, rejected the Puritans too, because they felt they had not cleansed the church enough. Like a horse that had been confined all its life in the deep darkness of a mine, bringing it into the light of day is blinding. So reformers in their blind condition could not bear to see the light of truth all at once. It was a gradual and painful learning process, and for most Protestants, which Rome fully recognized and despised, it was not a short-lived passing fancy, for they were not motivated by politics as was Henry VIII, but were completely sincere and intensely dedicated to the love of scriptural truth, their consciences compelling them to live their lives according to the light they had come to understand. But the second and most disturbing problem that frustrated and gnawed at Rome was that this deep-rooted malignancy was being carried and planted in the New World. For it was exactly the same time when England had become a boiling cauldron of religious enmity that she was also planting her colonies in the North American continent. No one recognized this dilemma of Rome better than the Jesuits, and they had a mind to do something about it. They would go to America, not South America, mind you, where Catholicism was already wondrously flourishing in a fresh new land without pestilent Protestants, but where the horrors of the Inquisition and genocide were deliciously in full swing. And not to the European continent either, where Germany was being exterminated clean during the 1618 to 1648 30 Years' War, to provide vast vacancies that could have been filled by the terribly persecuted English Catholics. But the Jesuits would plant a Catholic colony among the English North Americans. Imagine it. It's almost like a miracle or gift from God, as they piously declared that it was to be a refuge and sanctuary, the only in the world, where all the religiously persecuted and oppressed could come and find a safe haven of rest, or so the Catholic legend goes. And we're going to read this final section before we close part 1 of this reading of chapter 13, which is entitled Secretary of State George Calvert. Again, now we're going to start stepping on some fanciful toes that are ground-rooted in American patriotism here. So it's going to get very interesting as the reading continues forth from here on out. So, here we go. It seemed that whenever the English crown had a need for matching a royal marriage, they couldn't resist going fishing in the waters of Spain. Henry VIII's first bride was Spanish, and so was his daughter, Mary Tudor's husband. And now James I, in spite of his professing to be Protestant, was also negotiating for a Spanish bride for his son, Charles I. And by the way, it's the same James I that gave the authority for the translators for the King James Version. So, again, this isn't to bash the King James Version of the Bible. This is just given the simple fact of, just because you have a king that is supposedly Protestant doesn't mean he's got skeletons. Does not mean that he does not have skeletons in his closet. Okay? But news about this time in England of the 30 Years' War eruption that saw the army of the League and Spanish battalions marching up the valley of the Rhine only served to accentuate and strengthen hidden fears and arouse fierce Protestant passions. A strong anti-Catholic war party sprung up, and when Parliament reassembled in 1621, after its 7 years' recess, the storm of opposition against the Spanish match broke loose. The war party that was urging England to intervene and declare war against Spain and give aid to the German Protestant cause certainly was in no mood to tolerate a plan that would place a Catholic queen on the throne of England. However, the king, on the advice of the Secretary of State, George Calvert, and other Catholic counselors, refused the demands, declaring he would govern according to the common weal, not according to the common will. And so the negotiations for a Catholic Spanish bride continued, and a Protestant sore was left to fester. George Calvert was a great favorite of King James I, and after James I, that favoritism continued on through his son Charles I. In 1617, James I, in recognition of Calvert's public services, conferred on him the Order of Knighthood, and 2 years later he was elevated to the office of Secretary of State and became a member of the King's Privy Council. Also, as a reward for faithful services, the king granted him, in 1621, a manor of 2,300 acres in the county of Longford, Ireland. In 1625, the king then elevated him to the Irish peerage as Baron Baltimore of Baltimore in County Longford. Thus, in a matter of a few years, George Calvert rose to phenomenal power, wealth, and influence, and in a few more years was to fix his name forever in a colony of the New World. But for the present time, King James I had selected Calvert, a man distinguished, well qualified, and anxiously in favor of the plan, to handle a very ticklish and delicate undertaking, to obtain a Spanish Catholic bride for his 20-year son. Protestant England, with stringent anti-Catholic laws, negotiating with Catholic Spain, who demanded those laws repealed as a condition for granting a Spanish bride. King James I and his small clique of Catholic court advisors, known as the Spanish Party, the same that William Allen with the Jesuits more than 40 years before had become a leader of, but was now headed up by George Calvert and the Jesuits, became discreetly cautious as it became known of their plans to make an alliance with Spain, although the proposed marriage of the Crown Prince Charles with the Spanish Infanta, Donna Maria. Throwing all caution to the wind by ignoring public and parliamentary outcries against such a union, George Calvert had made good progress with the treaty negotiations that complied with the Pope's demands that was stipulated in 1622 in return for his marriage dispensation. So Calvert was careful to include in the marriage treaty a clause granting full religious liberty to the Catholics of England and freedom from further persecution. Also, a Catholic education for the children of the marriage, a Catholic household for the Infanta, and a Catholic chapel at the English court were all guaranteed. Then a secret treaty granting further concessions was signed later at the home of the Spanish ambassador, with James I, King James I, giving his full approval, ratified by his oath. And folks, one other thing about King James I and the King James Bible, okay, is there's nothing wrong with the King James Bible. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with King James I granting that this Bible be printed. But what the problem lies in is the fact that those defenders, like myself, I defend the King James Version of the Bible because it's my preferred version, okay? But those that defend it will also, have the staunch defense of King James I without even blinking an eye as to what went on during his reign and what also else he did. They'll just throw that all aside and say King James I was a man of God because he was the one responsible for the formation of the King James Bible. So therefore, he must have been pure. Well, folks, let's look at Nebuchadnezzar, okay? Now, we know that Nebuchadnezzar eventually was converted, okay? But let's just look at him for an example, all right? Here, Nebuchadnezzar granted Daniel and his friends providence over Babylon, okay, because he could interpret the king's dreams when no one else could interpret them. Now, during this time, this was before his conversion, okay, but during this time, he was still very much active in his religious affairs, his pagan customs, his pride, to the point where he would even throw his own men who he found beloved in his sight because he could interpret these dreams into a fiery furnace. Okay? It's the same concept as with King James I. Alright? Just because he was labeled a Protestant doesn't necessarily mean he was all for Protestantism, because he backed a lot of Catholic ideals. Okay, so he was basically a swinger. He swung both ways. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out, that even though the King James Bible is called the King James Bible because it was King James himself that, put in authority that this Bible be produced, and it's a wonderful work. It's a wonderful Bible. It's one that is in my opinion, holds authority over all the other English versions out there. But at the same time, you got to understand it. King James I wasn't, like I just said just a moment ago. He had some skeletons in his closet. And you have to recognize that. Anyways, back to the book. And obviously, he was a staunch supporter of George Calvert, as we just read. So, George Calvert was doing quite well in his efforts to shackle England again with Catholicism. That is, until Prince Charles got a brainstorm and blew everything out of the water. Secretly, he had appeared in person at the Spanish court as the suitor for the hand of the Infanta. But it seems that while he was there, offenses were given and offenses were taken on both sides that resulted in a complete breakdown of discussions. So the prince and his envoy returned to England without the bride. When the news got out that the negotiations... Wow, that was a butcher of a word. When the news got out that the negotiations had ended up in a failure, celebrations rocked the streets of London with great rejoicing and lighting of bonfires. However, there was no joy for the Spanish party, which had no other choice but to quickly vanish from public view. But Prince Charles had an alternative on his mind. On his way to Spain, he had stopped off at Paris and laid eyes on the lovely French princess, Henrietta Maria. That was the girl he wanted for his bride, and actually afterwards married. A girl so Catholic, she wouldn't even appear at his coronation, and whose name Charles later named the colony of Maryland for. As for George Calvert, he too had an alternative plan in mind. George Calvert understood perfectly which way the religious wind was blowing in England, and like all wealthy and influential Catholics who shuddered at the very thought of losing their popish powers, was determined to recapture those strayed minds that had been so dangerously set free from the captivities of Rome, and were now disgracefully diverting precious funds from the Pope's treasury. England, as far as Rome was concerned, was a religious mission, where its people had to be converted and brought back into the papal fold. If not by outright force, then by pressure or deceptive persuasion. This backup tactic of extending the hand of peace until superiority can be gained is a hallmark of the Jesuits that has been used time and again to accomplish their purposes. And we will stop right here, and we will pick up in part 2 of chapter 13 of the Grand Design Exposed. Thank you for listening. Truth be told, truth be known. Stay safe. God bless. And we will see you next time. Bye-bye.